"We got a lot of work ahead of us," Marcus said, glancing over at her. "But we can't do it alone." The girl nodded. "I know. We need allies, people who understand what's at stake." Marcus thought for a moment. He wasn't sure where to start. The people they could trust were few and far between, but that didn't matter. They could build something. They could find people who were willing to fight, people who weren't afraid of the truth. "We'll find them," Marcus said, his voice steady with newfound confidence. "There are people out there who will believe us, people who will fight with us. We just have to find them." The girl's gaze softened. "You don't know how much this means to me." Marcus shook his head. "I don't think I'd fully understand yet, but I will. I promise." They stood there for a while longer, the soft breeze ruffling their clothes, before Marcus turned and began walking down the hill. The girl followed him, her steps lighter now. They didn't have to speak to understand what the other was thinking. They both knew that the road ahead was going to be long and dangerous. But they were ready. Together, they could face anything. As they reached the bottom of the hill, the first of the city's citizens began to appear on the streets. People were going about their daily routines, unaware of the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. The authorities were still looking for the girl, and the alien forces were still a threat. But there was a sense of calm in Marcus now. The city, the world, didn't know what was coming. But he did, and he wasn't going to let it happen without a fight. "What now?" the girl asked, her voice breaking the silence as they walked through the city's bustling streets. Marcus looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. "Now we make sure this city knows the truth. We find the people who will help us. We protect the crystal. And most of all, we fight." The girl's eyes sparkled. "We fight." Marcus smiled. For the first time, it wasn't just the fight for survival that he was focused on. It was a fight for something bigger, a fight for the future. For a future where humans and aliens could coexist, where power wasn't controlled by a select few, where the truth could finally come to light. They reached a small, hidden alleyway, one that Marcus had discovered during his time in the city. It was a safe place, a temporary hiding spot. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. "We can rest here," Marcus said, pushing open the small, rusted door. "Just for a bit. We need to lay low, gather information, and make our next move." The girl nodded, stepping inside the small room. She set the box with the crystal down on a table, her fingers lightly brushing over it. It was strange, almost like a part of her, this crystal. She had said it was important, but she still didn't fully understand its power. Neither of them did, but they would learn. They had to. As they sat down, the girl turned to Marcus, her eyes serious. "Do you think they'll stop looking for us?" Marcus shook his head. "No, not for a while. But we'll be ready." The silence between them felt different now. It wasn't heavy with fear or uncertainty. It was a silence filled with possibility. They both knew that the journey ahead would be tough, that they would face challenges they couldn't even begin to imagine. But it didn't matter. They had each other, and that was enough. Outside, the city continued to move. People continued to live their lives, unaware of the war that was quietly unfolding. But Marcus and the girl knew the truth, and they were ready to fight for it. For the first time since everything had begun, Marcus felt a sense of peace. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living, and this was just the beginning. As the girl began to stir, her glowing eyes flickered open. She blinked, confused and disoriented. Her mouth parted, but no words came out. Marcus could feel her fear, and in that moment, he realized that she was just as vulnerable as any human. She wasn't some ruthless warrior, some cold-blooded enemy. She was scared, alone, and in need of help. You're safe," Marcus said softly, unsure of whether she could understand him. He reached out a hand, not sure if she would flinch or strike, but instead, she gazed at him with wide eyes, still too weak to move. Her trembling hand touched the thermal blanket, and Marcus noticed that her fingers, though alien, were delicate, almost fragile. The girl's lips parted again, and this time words came out, but they weren't in any language Marcus had ever heard. The sound was melodic, almost musical, but it carried an edge of desperation. She tried to speak again, but her voice was weak, strained. Marcus leaned closer, trying to catch the meaning behind her words, but all he could do was offer her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry. You're safe now." She stared at him for a long moment, her glowing eyes filled with confusion and gratitude. She didn't say anything more, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made Marcus feel uneasy. Gratitude, or was it fear? He couldn't tell. Marcus stood up and took a step back, scanning the area for anyone who could help. A small crowd had gathered, all staring at the alien girl with a mix of awe and suspicion. People whispered to each other, but none of them dared to approach her. After all, she was an alien, and in a world where trust was hard to come by. No one knew if this was just a trick or a trap. "Do you have any idea who she is?" one of the bystanders asked, a middle-aged man with a nervous look on his face. Marcus shook his head. "No, but she's just a kid. She needs help." The man seemed hesitant, glancing nervously at the girl. "You're taking a big risk, saving her. She's not one of us." Marcus didn't care about that. He didn't care that she was alien. The only thing that mattered now was that she was alive, and in need of assistance. As the girl began to sit up, her eyes locked onto Marcus. She reached out her hand, trembling slightly, and in a soft voice, whispered words that Marcus could barely understand. "Thank you." It was the first time she had spoken in a language he recognized, and it struck him deeply, even though her voice was faint and barely audible. The emotion behind it was clear: gratitude. The girl, this alien who had been raised to hate humans, was thanking him. And for the first time since the war ended, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Marcus sat by the edge of the platform, watching the alien girl carefully. She was wrapped in a thermal blanket, her skin still shimmering faintly in the dim light. The crowd that had gathered was slowly starting to disperse, unsure of what to make of this strange event. But Marcus couldn't take his eyes off her. There was something about her, something that made him feel like there was more to this situation than just saving a life. The girl was still recovering, her breathing slow and steady. Her eyes fluttered closed for a moment, and Marcus couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. He didn't know if she understood him when he spoke, but when she had whispered that simple "thank you," something inside him had clicked. It wasn't the usual coldness he expected from her kind. It was genuine. A few minutes passed before she finally stirred again. Her eyes opened, and this time she seemed more alert. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to adjust to the unfamiliar surroundings. The soft glow in her eyes dimmed slightly, as if the shock of the water had temporarily overwhelmed her powers. Her gaze slowly moved across the platform, taking in the humans who were still watching her with wary eyes. Marcus stood up, his boots making soft thuds against the metal floor of the platform. He approached the girl carefully, not wanting to startle her. He had seen enough in his time as a soldier to know that some species could be unpredictable when they felt cornered. But this girl, she didn't look like she was ready to fight. She looked scared, vulnerable. That made no sense, not for someone from the Zithar, the most technologically advanced and ruthless alien race known to humanity. When he reached her, she didn't flinch. Instead, she slowly lifted her hand, almost as if in a greeting. Her skin glowed brighter as her fingers stretched toward him, delicate and trembling. Her eyes locked onto his, full of confusion. There was a spark of recognition, but it wasn't like the cold stare of an enemy. It was a look of someone who had been through something terrible and had no idea what to do next. "You're safe now," Marcus said again, this time more softly. He knelt beside her, trying to reassure her, even though part of him still felt uneasy. The Zithar had been fierce opponents during the war, their fleets and weapons unlike anything humanity had ever seen. But here, in front of him, was a girl who didn't seem like a soldier or an invader. She looked human, in a way. She was scared, vulnerable, and alone. The girl blinked again, as if processing his words. Her voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke, her words broken and soft, in a language Marcus didn't recognize. It wasn't one of the common languages spoken by the various alien species on Earth. He could only make out a few words, but they didn't help much. She continued speaking, the strange sounds flowing from her lips like a melody. But Marcus didn't understand. He shook his head, feeling a little frustrated. He needed to know what she was saying, but her words were lost in the wind. However, there was something else in her voice, something beyond the language barrier. She wasn't hostile. In fact, there was a strange kindness in the way she spoke, despite the confusion in her eyes. "I don't understand," Marcus admitted, his voice low but gentle. "But I'm here to help." The girl paused and stared at him for a long moment. Her eyes, which had been glowing faintly, flickered again, as if they were trying to focus. Then, without warning, she reached out and touched his arm. It was a tentative gesture, as if she was testing whether he would pull away. But Marcus didn't flinch. He felt the cool touch of her fingers against his skin, and for a moment, all the differences between them, human and alien, soldier and survivor, seemed to vanish. She pulled her hand back quickly, almost as if embarrassed. Her eyes flickered toward the ground, and Marcus could see the faintest traces of embarrassment in her expression. It was a look that any human would recognize. She wasn't just a stranger in a foreign land. She was a person. A young girl who had no idea what had happened to her or where she was. For a brief moment, Marcus felt a pang of guilt. Why had he assumed she would be a cold, ungrateful enemy? Why had he believed that all aliens were the same, just because of the war? This girl, this alien girl, wasn't a soldier or an invader. She was just someone who had gotten caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. A voice interrupted his thoughts. It was one of the bystanders who had been watching from a distance. "What are you going to do with her?" the man asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "She's one of them, the Zithar." Marcus looked up at the man. The crowd had gathered again, more hesitant now, and they were all staring at the girl with mixed emotions. Fear, curiosity, and disbelief filled the air. The Zithar had been humanity's greatest enemy in the war. They had come with their ships, their weapons, their advanced technology. Thousands of lives had been lost fighting them. And now, here was one of them, sitting in front of Marcus, with nothing but fear in her eyes. Marcus sighed and turned his attention back to the girl. She was still sitting there, staring at the ground, lost in her thoughts. The thermal blanket that had been wrapped around her was now falling off, and she seemed too weak to adjust it. Marcus bent down and gently pulled the blanket back over her shoulders, his hand brushing against her soft skin. She didn't react, but there was a slight tremor in her hands as she clutched the fabric. "Hey," Marcus said softly, trying to break the silence. "It's going to be okay." She looked up at him again, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Then, as if sensing his sincerity, she did something that surprised him. She slowly raised her hand to her chest and bowed her head slightly, as though in some form of gratitude. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Marcus to see that she was trying. She wasn't attacking him. She wasn't plotting anything. She was simply thanking him. For a moment, Marcus didn't know what to say. He'd been trained to fight, to protect, to survive. But this was different. This wasn't a war. This was a person, a girl who had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The girl's lips parted slightly, and she whispered again, the same words as before, but this time with a bit more clarity. "Thank you." It wasn't just a word. It was an expression of something deeper. Gratitude, yes, but also something else. Recognition. She was acknowledging him, not as an enemy or a soldier, but as a person. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt something shift inside him. It wasn't anger or hatred. It wasn't fear. It was something new. something he hadn't felt in years. He smiled, a small, soft smile, and nodded. "You're welcome." The crowd around them was still murmuring, but Marcus didn't care. All that mattered was that this girl, this alien who had been trained to destroy, was showing him gratitude. It didn't make sense. It didn't fit with everything he'd been taught. But it felt right. The girl smiled weakly, her glowing eyes flickering with a light that seemed to come from within her. It was a simple smile, but it was enough. Enough to remind Marcus that not all aliens were enemies, and not all the things he had learned during the war were true. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus believed that there could be hope for something different, something better, something that didn't involve war and bloodshed. "Let's get you out of here," he said, helping her to her feet. The crowd parted as they walked toward the edge of the platform, but Marcus didn't care. He wasn't doing this for anyone else. He was doing it for her, for the girl who had shown him that even in the most unlikely of places, gratitude could still exist. Marcus was unsure of what to do next. His instincts told him to leave the crowd behind and get the alien girl to safety. But he wasn't sure where safe even was anymore. The city was a maze of platforms and bridges, and it wasn't the best place for an alien, especially not one from the Sithar species. He had no idea if her kind had allies in this city, or if she was just as isolated as he was. The girl, still weak but standing, looked up at him with eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. Her delicate features were pale, and her thin frame trembled under the weight of the thermal blanket she still clutched tightly around herself. Her skin, which had a faint, almost ethereal glow, now looked dimmer, like it was losing its strength. Marcus hesitated. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, trying to keep his voice calm. The girl didn't answer. She only looked around nervously, her eyes darting from one face to another. It was clear that she felt like a stranger in this place, like she didn't belong. The whispers of the crowd had not stopped. Some people had taken out their personal devices, recording the scene with suspicion in their eyes. "What's going to happen to her?" a voice asked from behind, sounding more fearful than curious. Marcus ignored them. "Stay close," he said to the girl, not giving her a chance to respond before turning toward the far end of the platform. He motioned for her to follow, leading her away from the prying eyes of the crowd. His mind raced, trying to think of the best way to get her out of here without drawing attention. As they walked, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The girl had shown gratitude, yes, but there was still something unsettling about the whole situation. He had no idea what had happened to her. Why had she been in the water? Why had she been alone? He glanced back at her, but her eyes were fixed on the ground, her steps slow and hesitant. She wasn't saying anything. In fact, she hadn't said much since that first "thank you." They reached a small alley between two towering structures, one of the quieter parts of the city, where the crowds didn't often go. Marcus turned to her. "I don't know where we can go, but I can't just leave you here. You're not safe." The girl looked up at him with those large, glowing eyes. For a moment, Marcus thought she might say something, but she just nodded, her lips pressed together in a thin line. It was the first time she had reacted like that, and it made Marcus uneasy. She wasn't speaking, but he could feel the weight of her silence. "I'm Marcus," he said, trying to break the tension. "Marcus Holt." He held out his hand, hoping she might respond. But instead, she took a small step backward, almost as if she was trying to keep her distance. It wasn't rejection. It was more like caution. The kind of caution someone might have when they didn't trust anyone, even if they didn't want to show it. For a moment, Marcus hesitated. "Look, I'm not going to hurt you," he said, feeling ridiculous. Why was he even saying that? But the girl's eyes seemed to soften, just a little. She didn't seem as afraid as before, but the wariness was still there. As they stood there in the alley, Marcus glanced around, trying to come up with a plan. He knew the city well enough to know there were safe houses for those in need, but could he risk taking an alien there? The Zithar weren't exactly well-liked among the humans. In fact, most people feared them. There was no way the authorities would let him just walk in with a Zithar girl, especially if the people here started making noise about what had happened. "I need to find a way out of here," Marcus muttered to himself. But the girl caught his words. She looked up at him, confusion in her eyes. Her alien mind seemed to be piecing things together, slowly. She had heard stories, no doubt, of human distrust, of the war, of the things her kind had done. Was she starting to realize that Marcus wasn't just helping her out of kindness, but also because he had nowhere else to turn? "Follow me," he said, his voice more firm this time. He turned and began to move toward the back alley, feeling the girl's presence behind him. She was still hesitant, but she followed. They moved quickly through the winding streets, trying to keep a low profile. Marcus could feel his heart racing. He was taking a huge risk. If anyone found out what he was doing, what he had done, it could mean trouble. The Zithar had been enemies of humanity for so long, and now he was walking around with one, a young girl who was in no condition to fend for herself. The city had its own rules, and humans and aliens had learned to coexist by following them. But this wasn't normal. The girl was a Zithar. She wasn't supposed to be in a place like this, and certainly not walking around like she was just another person. They'd made their way down another narrow street, and Marcus stopped by an old service door hidden beneath a dim light. He didn't know why he chose this place. Maybe because it was quiet and isolated, or maybe because it was the only option left. He knocked on the door 3 times, a sharp tap, then waited. The silence of the city pressed in on him. A few moments later, the door creaked open just enough to show a pair of cautious eyes peering through the crack. Marcus didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed the door open a little wider. "I need your help," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I'm with someone who needs shelter." The door opened fully, revealing an older woman with a serious expression. Her gray hair was tied back in a bun, and she wore the same tired look as most people in the city, worn out from the constant struggle to get by. But when she saw the girl behind Marcus, her eyes widened slightly. She quickly masked it, but Marcus noticed. "You brought her here?" the woman asked, her voice soft, but filled with suspicion. "A Zithar? Are you crazy?" Marcus stood his ground. "She's not a threat. She's just lost." The woman studied them both for a long moment. Then, with a sigh, she stepped aside and let them in. "Come in quickly," she said, "and don't make any noise. The less attention we draw, the better." Marcus nodded and led the girl inside. The woman closed the door behind them, locking it with a low click. They were in a small, dimly lit room filled with old furniture and crates stacked against the walls. It was a place for people to lay low when they had nowhere else to go. Marcus didn't know if this woman was an ally or just someone who took in strays, but at this point, he was willing to trust anyone who would help. "Sit," the woman said, pointing to an old chair by a small table. Marcus helped the girl into the chair, her face still pale, but now calmer. She was beginning to relax, though the fear was still there, lurking in the back of her eyes. "Do you need anything?" Marcus asked. He wasn't sure what to offer, but it seemed like the right thing to say. The woman grunted. "Some food wouldn't hurt, but we'll have to be careful. If the authorities catch wind of this, we'll all be in trouble." Marcus nodded, understanding. They couldn't afford to make any noise. They had to stay hidden. "I'll keep an eye on her," Marcus said, feeling the weight of the situation settling on him. The girl, still quiet and distant, didn't seem to trust him completely, but at least she was safe for now. The woman left the room, and Marcus sat down beside the girl. For the first time since finding her in the water, he felt like he could breathe. But the question still hung in the air. Why had she been in the water? What was she running from? And who was looking for her? Marcus didn't have the answers yet, but as he looked at the girl, he knew one thing for sure. He had to protect her. Because this wasn't just about saving a life anymore. It was about something bigger, something that could change everything. The room was quiet, too quiet. The air was thick with tension, and even though Marcus tried to keep his thoughts focused, his mind kept drifting back to the girl. The alien girl, who, for reasons he couldn't understand, was now sitting in front of him, not as a threat, but as a fragile being in need of help. She was someone he had rescued, someone who had no one else. And despite the world he had grown up in, despite all the prejudice and fear that had been drilled into him over the years, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this girl wasn't an enemy. The soft hum of the room's light was the only sound that filled the space. Outside, the city continued its usual hum of noise, but here, inside the small, dimly lit room, it was a world apart. The woman who had let them in had gone off to gather food and supplies, leaving Marcus alone with the girl. She sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, her head tilted slightly as if lost in thought. Her glowing skin had dimmed even further, and she appeared to be drained, both physically and mentally. She hadn't said a word since they arrived. Her silence was heavy, and Marcus wasn't sure what to make of it. She was grateful, he could tell, but there was something else beneath that gratitude. Something deeper. "Hey," Marcus finally broke the silence. He didn't know why he felt the need to speak, but it seemed like the right thing to do. "You can talk to me, you know." The girl's eyes flickered toward him, her expression unreadable. For a second, he thought she might speak, but she just looked away again, as if unsure whether she should. It was clear she was processing everything that had happened. The crash, the water, the human who had pulled her out, the strange city, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Marcus sat down across from her, not wanting to crowd her, but still wanting to make sure she felt like she wasn't alone. "I know you don't trust me yet," he said, "and that's okay. You don't have to talk if you're not ready." Her gaze slowly returned to him, her eyes still filled with hesitation. She shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the blanket she still clutched. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a moment of understanding that crossed the barrier of language. "I don't know your language," Marcus continued, trying to keep things casual. "But I want to help. We can figure this out together." The girl's lips parted, and for the first time, she made a sound. It wasn't a word, more like a soft sigh, but it was something. Marcus didn't know if it was an attempt to speak or just a sign of frustration, but he didn't press her. Instead, he smiled reassuringly. As the minutes passed, Marcus tried to think of something to break the ice, something that could help bridge the gap between them. He wasn't great with words, especially not when it came to someone like her, someone from another world, but there had to be something he could do to make her feel more at ease. He stood up and moved to the small, grimy window, peering outside. The city below was alive with lights and movement, people rushing to and fro, unaware of the hidden story unfolding just above them. The sight of it all, so normal, so mundane, made Marcus feel even more disconnected from the world. Here he was, helping an alien girl who had just barely survived, while everything around him continued without pause. He glanced back at her. "It's strange, isn't it?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. "How everything just keeps moving, even when something big happens, like no one notices when something's different." The girl's eyes followed his movements, but she didn't answer. It was as if she was listening, but unsure whether to respond. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer. Then she looked down at her hands. Marcus sighed. He didn't expect her to talk, but he still couldn't help wanting to hear her voice. "Look," he said, turning back to face her, "I know this must be terrifying for you. You were probably just going about your business when this happened. I don't know what's going on, and I'm not going to pretend to. But I do know that I'm not going to let anyone hurt you, not while I'm here." She didn't move, but Marcus saw the faintest flicker of something in her eyes. Was it hope? Or maybe just the relief of not being alone? He wasn't sure, but it was something, and it was enough for him to continue. "I don't know where you're from, or why you ended up here," he said, sitting down again. "But if you need help, I'll be here. I'll protect you. Whatever it takes. For the first time, the girl shifted. Her body was stiff from the ordeal, but she slowly raised her hand, trembling slightly. She pointed to the corner of the room, where a small pile of crates was stacked. Her finger hovered in the air as if trying to communicate something. Marcus frowned, following her gaze. "What are you pointing at?" he asked, standing up again and moving toward the crates. He glanced back at her, but she remained silent. Her eyes were fixed on the pile. When Marcus reached the crates, he hesitated before moving them aside. What was she trying to tell them? Was there something there? Something important? He pulled the crates away, one by one, until he uncovered a small, dusty metal box hidden beneath them. It was a strange, unfamiliar object, nothing like anything he had ever seen before. He carefully knelt down and reached for the box, his fingers brushing against the cold surface. It was smooth and metallic, with strange symbols etched into the side. Marcus turned it over in his hands, trying to make sense of it. The symbols were unfamiliar, the language foreign to him. He wasn't sure what to do with it, but when he glanced back at the girl, he saw something in her eyes, a silent urgency. I think this is important, isn't it?" Marcus muttered, still looking at the box. He turned it over again, trying to figure out how it worked, but there was no obvious way to open it. The girl stood up, her movements stiff but determined. She walked over to him, her hand outstretched, and for the first time, Marcus saw a clear look of trust in her eyes. She wanted him to give it to her. "All right," Marcus said softly, handing the box to her. "It's yours, I think." The girl took the box in her hands, holding it gently as though it were fragile. She looked at it for a moment, then glanced back at Marcus. Her eyes were full of gratitude, and there was a new warmth in her gaze. It wasn't just fear anymore. There was something else, something like recognition, maybe even trust. She slowly knelt down in front of the box, her fingers running over the symbols. After a moment, there was a faint click, and the box slowly opened with a soft hiss. Inside, nestled carefully, was a small glowing crystal. It shone with a soft blue light, its surface smooth and almost otherworldly. The girl carefully lifted it from the box, her face lighting up with awe. This is important, isn't it?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. He had no idea what the crystal was, but it seemed like it was everything to her. She nodded slowly, then turned to face him. Her expression was still serious, but there was something different about it now, something that felt like an unspoken connection. For the first time since they had met, the barrier between them seemed to fade away. It wasn't just the girl who had shown him gratitude. It was the beginning of something more, something he couldn't yet fully understand. "I don't know what it is," Marcus said, looking down at the crystal in her hands. "But if you trust me, we'll figure this out together." The girl's gaze softened, and she placed the crystal gently back into the box. Then, without saying a word, she reached out and placed a hand on his arm. A simple touch, but one that spoke volumes. For a moment, Marcus forgot everything. The city, the dangers, the unknown future, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the quiet bond forming between him and this alien girl. It was a bond based on trust, on survival, and maybe even on something deeper than that. And for the first time, Marcus felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way to bridge the gap between their worlds. The air was thick with tension. Marcus could feel it in his bones. Every sound in the room seemed amplified, as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The girl, who had slowly become more than just a stranger, sat quietly across from him. Her gaze was focused, determined, but the weight of what was coming hung heavy in her eyes. They both knew this wasn't over. The danger wasn't gone. Outside the safe house, the streets were bustling, just as they always were, but Marcus knew that beneath the surface, something was about to break. The authorities had finally caught wind of the alien girl's presence in the city. It didn't matter how careful they were. Someone had seen them. Someone had reported them. And now the clock was ticking. Marcus stood, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to the girl. She was still clutching the box with the glowing crystal inside, her hands trembling slightly. He didn't need to ask her what it meant. He already knew. The crystal was the key, the thing that the authorities, and worse, the alien forces hunting her, wanted. It was a power that neither of them fully understood, but it was a power that could change everything. "We have to move now," Marcus said, his voice firm, but his mind racing. "The authorities are coming. They won't stop until they have you." The girl stood up, her eyes locked on his, and without a word she nodded. There was no hesitation. Marcus could see it in her face now. Her fear had turned into something else. It was resolve. They had been through too much together to run now. Too much to let this all end in defeat. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting back. And for the first time, Marcus felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in a long time. They moved swiftly, Marcus leading the way through the small, dimly lit house. He had no idea where they were going, but he knew they couldn't stay here. They had to get out, and fast. The door creaked open, and they stepped into the narrow alley, the night air cool against their skin. Marcus glanced around, trying to spot any signs of movement. The city seemed normal enough, but there was an undercurrent of unease that made his skin crawl. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed them, before they were surrounded, and he couldn't afford to get caught. They walked quickly, staying in the shadows, avoiding the main streets. Every step felt like it might be their last. Marcus' mind raced, thinking about the options they had. They had no backup, no safe house, no place to hide. All they had was the crystal, and the girl who was now relying on him. "Where are we going?" the girl asked suddenly, her voice soft but filled with determination. It was the first time she had spoken since their escape. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but I'll figure it out. I promise." They continued to move, taking sharp turns down side streets and alleyways, trying to stay hidden. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. His instincts told him that they were being hunted, and they weren't just up against the authorities anymore. There were others after them, alien forces that had been tracking the girl long before she ended up in the water. The Zithar were known for their ruthlessness, and the girl, with her crystal, was the key to something much bigger than Marcus could ever imagine. As they rounded another corner, Marcus froze. He could hear it. The sound of footsteps, quiet but growing louder. He turned to the girl, his eyes wide with alarm. "They found us," he whispered. The girl's expression hardened, and for the first time since they met, Marcus saw the full strength of her resolve. She wasn't just a helpless alien girl anymore. She was a fighter. She stepped closer to him, placing the box with the crystal into his hands. "Protected," she said, her voice calm, but there was a quiet force behind her words. "They can't have it." Before Marcus could respond, a flash of movement caught his eye. From the shadows ahead, a group of soldiers appeared. They were human, but their eyes, cold and relentless, told a different story. They were part of a special task force, the ones who dealt with threats like the Zithar, and they weren't here to talk. Marcus's heart raced. He knew he was outmatched. These soldiers had the best technology, the best weapons, and they were trained to deal with situations like this. But there was one thing they didn't have. Marcus wasn't going down without a fight. He wasn't going to let them take her. Not after everything they had been through. "Run," Marcus shouted to the girl. "Go. Now." She hesitated for a split second, then turned and sprinted down the alley, her figure disappearing into the darkness. The soldiers shouted orders, but Marcus was already moving. He pulled out a small, hidden weapon from his jacket. Just a stun gun, nothing fancy, but it was better than nothing. The soldiers moved quickly, closing the distance. Marcus aimed the stun gun and fired. A crackling sound filled the air as the first soldier dropped to the ground. temporarily incapacitated. But there were more of them, and they were coming fast. Marcus didn't have time to think. He grabbed the box with the crystal and ran after the girl, zigzagging through the alleyways, trying to shake off their pursuers. His breath was coming in short bursts, and his legs were burning, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close to escape. He heard the soldiers behind him, their footsteps heavy on the concrete, but he didn't dare look back. All he could do was keep running, keep pushing forward. And then, just as he rounded a corner, he saw her. The girl was standing still, waiting for him. She looked back at him, her expression unreadable. The ship's energy weapons charge, and Ethan knew they were done for. They had no way of stopping what was coming. But just as he braced for the final blow, a strange sound echoed through the ship, soft and almost melodic, like a voice on the wind. Then everything stopped. The light from the incoming blast dimmed. The energy weapons aimed at them fizzled out. The ship seemed to freeze in space, held in a strange, invisible grip. Ethan blinked, trying to make sense of what was happening. He saw Sarah looking at him in disbelief. "What the hell just happened?" she whispered. Ethan didn't have time to answer. Before he could react, a figure appeared on the ship's view screen. She was tall, regal, and her features were sharp and alien, but somehow elegant. She had long, flowing hair that shimmered with a faint glow, and her eyes, golden and piercing, stared directly into Ethan's soul. "I am Queen Corellia of the Zarksians," she spoke, her voice both melodic and commanding. "And you, human, have caught my attention." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had heard of the Zarksian queen, but seeing her in person was a different experience. She radiated power and authority, and the way she looked at him felt like she could see into his very being. "You?" Ethan began, trying to make sense of the situation, but his mind was spinning. "What do you want with me?" Corellia smiled, a dangerous glint in her eyes. "You've already given me what I need," she said softly, her voice sending chills down his spine. "You got me pregnant, human." Ethan's world spun. He didn't know whether to laugh or scream. "What?" he sputtered, utterly confused. The queen's smile widened, and for the first time, Ethan saw something like amusement flicker across her face. "Yes, you, human, are the father of my child." Ethan sat in the darkened chamber, the air cold and sterile, yet it felt suffocating. The massive warship, Zarksian in design, sleek and terrifying, was now his prison, or perhaps his sanctuary. For hours, he had been held inside the Queen's personal quarters, a place that seemed oddly serene compared to the chaos of the battle outside. The soft hum of alien machinery filled the air, and every now and then, a faint pulse of light would flicker in the walls, responding to commands Ethan couldn't hear. The technology aboard this ship was so advanced, it made Earth's finest ships look like mere toys in comparison. Corellia, the Zarksian queen, had allowed him to sit here for a reason. It was clear now that the battle had been just the beginning of something far more complicated. She had claimed him, not as a prisoner, but as the father of her child. And that declaration had left Ethan with more questions than answers. His mind raced with possibilities. How had this happened? How could an alien queen be pregnant with a human child? The idea seemed impossible, even absurd. But the look in Corellia's eyes, the way she spoke, told him she wasn't lying. She wasn't joking. At the thought of her, he couldn't help but wonder, what kind of creature was she? What was her true nature? And what was it about her species, the Zarksians, that made them such a powerful force in the galaxy? A soft hiss echoed from the door as it slid open, and Corellia entered the room, her figure looming tall and regal. She wore the same dark, flowing armor she had on during their first meeting, and her eyes glowed with an eerie golden light. But there was something different about her this time, something almost warm. It was as if she was no longer the cold, calculating queen he had first encountered, but something far more human. "I see you have many questions, human," she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. "You wonder how such a thing could happen, don't you?" Ethan nodded, his throat dry. "Yeah, I'm struggling to make sense of all this. You say I'm the father of your child, but I don't even know how that's possible." Corelia stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "Let me explain." She paused, as if considering her words carefully. Then, with a deep breath, she began to speak. "The Zarksians are not like your kind. We are an ancient species, far older than humanity, and our civilization is built upon principles that are beyond your comprehension. We evolved on a distant planet, far from your solar system. Our biology is unique. We do not reproduce in the same way you do, but through a form of energy exchange, an exchange that can be affected by outside forces. In rare cases, this energy can merge with that of another species. The result is a hybrid being, one that possesses the strength of both races." Ethan's mind spun. A hybrid. A child that was half human, half Zarksian. The idea sounded like science fiction, but there was no denying the Queen's presence. She was real. And so, apparently, was the child she claimed to carry. "Energy exchange. Are you saying that?" He trailed off, not sure how to finish the question. "Yes," Corelia said, her golden eyes locking onto his. "It is possible for your species and mine to connect in such a way. It's rare, but it happens. And when it does, the child that results is powerful, capable of bridging the gap between our species. This child could change everything, human. It could be the key to ending this war." Ethan frowned, trying to understand. "But why me? Why did this happen to me?" Corelia smiled, a faint knowing curve of her lips. "Because you are unique. Your kind, humans, are unlike any species I have ever encountered. Your species' creativity, your capacity for emotion, your strength in the face of impossible odds. It's these qualities that drew us to you. We have watched your people for centuries. We saw the wars you fought, the way you never gave up, even when you were outmatched. We saw your potential." Ethan shook his head, still trying to piece everything together. "But you still attacked us. Why would you do that if you saw us as potential allies?" Corelia's expression hardened, her golden eyes narrowing. "Because we did not understand you at first. We thought you were nothing more than primitive creatures, unable to grasp the larger picture. But now we see differently. The war we have fought was not just about territory or resources. It was about survival. We feared what you could become, human." Ethan blinked, feeling a chill run down his spine. "You were afraid of us. Afraid of what your species could accomplish if you ever truly understood your own potential. Afraid of what a hybrid child, one with both Zarksian and human traits, could bring to the galaxy. This child has the potential to unite our species in a way no one ever thought possible. It could bring peace, or it could bring destruction. The choice will be yours, human." Ethan's thoughts swirled in confusion. The hybrid child. Peace or destruction. The weight of the situation began to sink in. He had never wanted to be part of something so grand, so world-changing. But now it seemed that he had no choice. "You're asking me to believe all this? That I'm the father of a child that could change the fate of two species?" "Yes," Corelia replied, her voice soft but firm. "That is exactly what I'm asking." Ethan stood up, pacing the room as his mind raced. He had never been one to shy away from danger, but this was beyond anything he had ever faced. And yet, somehow, it felt like fate had thrust him into the middle of a war he hadn't even known existed. "Why tell me all of this now?" he asked, looking back at her. "Why not just kill me and move on? You could have easily done that." Corelia's lips parted in a slight smile. "Because, human, I need you. We need you. You are the key to what comes next. Your people and mine are on the brink of a new future, but that future is uncertain. You must decide how you will play your part in this. Will you help us unite, or will you fight us until we destroy one another?" Ethan felt the weight of her words. The fate of two species rested on the shoulders of one human soldier. He had faced down countless enemies before, but this was different. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for the future of two races, his own and the Zarksians. For a long moment, there was silence in the room. Karelia stood tall and composed, watching him with those piercing golden eyes. Ethan knew that whatever he decided, there would be no turning back. "You want me to help you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "What happens if I refuse?" Karelia's expression softened, but her voice was still tinged with a warning. "If you refuse, you will doom us all. The war will continue, and both our species will be destroyed. The choice is yours, human. But remember, time is running out." Ethan let her words sink in. He had always known that war came with sacrifices, but this was something far greater. A child, a future, the fate of two species resting in the hands of one man. The Queen watched him intently, waiting for his answer. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he made a decision, one that would change everything. "I'll help you," he said finally, his voice resolute. "But I need to know more. How can we stop this war? How can we make sure that the child has a chance to change things?"